It's Veritas Forum with Dr. Craig Johnson, professor in residence of Chalcedon Christian Academy and pastor of Bethel Christian Fellowship in Agora Hills.
Welcome to Veritas Forum. My name is Craig Johnson. My special guest is James Patrick Holding. He's the president of Tecton Apologetics, author of Shattering the Christ Myth, and a new book on the reliability of the New Testament documents. Welcome, JP.
Oh, thank you, Craig.
We're going to talk about the historicity of the New Testament, the reliability of the New Testament documents. Christians have written many books on the topic. You have a new one. Tell us about it.
I'm working on it right now, and it has a working title of Trusting the New Testament. I'm going to be checking on that to see what I want to do with that title. I'm going to look at four basic aspects that have to do with the transmission of the New Testament, whether it was handed down to us reliably. I'm going to look at four aspects. I'm going to look at oral tradition, whether the word of mouth transmission was accurate. I'm going to look at the textual transmission of the New Testament, whether it was copied accurately down to our time. I'm going to look at the authorship of the New Testament documents, whether they were authentically by the persons whose names are on them. And I'm going to look at the formation of the canon.
Now, I just came back from Europe and was dealing with some atheists that I had met, and they are making claims such as there is not a shred of evidence that Jesus lived historically. There's not a shred of evidence that the four Gospels are primary source documents from the time of Jesus. They're all written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, and Christians have always had a presentation that the four Gospels are historically reliable. The manuscripts are in a good condition, therefore we can trust the information they give us. Where do we stand in that debate now?
Well, we stand in very good stead with all four of those issues that I mentioned. And the one in particular that is most brought up these days, I think, is the textual transmission aspect. I have heard so many people claim that the New Testament was gradually altered over time, that it originally didn't say that Jesus was divine or the Son of God, that it was entirely different when it was originally written, and that some evil people over time changed it, or maybe the Emperor Constantine changed it, or they'll have any number of people they'll say changed it. But the bottom line is they think that we've been sold a bill of goods with the New Testament, and that it's not what it originally said as far as what we have now.
Where do we stand with regard to the historicity and the quality and the reliability of the four Gospels?
Okay. In terms of the transmission aspect, or the
yes.
Okay. In terms of the transmission aspect, and this is for the entire New Testament, not just for the four Gospels, if you do a comparison with secular documents, we are so far ahead, it's shameful, okay? And this is one of the critical issues. When a lot of these atheists, like the ones you talked to, and you need some better friends, by the way, okay? A lot of these people you talk to, they will never do comparative statistics on other documents, okay? And I've looked into the literature by textual critics of secular documents, people who study like the works of Homer, or the works of Tacitus, the Roman historian, or the works of Josephus, the Jewish historian. They would love to have the wealth of evidence textually that we have for the New Testament. I think the most recent statistic was something like 5,600 copies in Greek alone of the New Testament, okay? The earliest one dating a little scrap of the Gospel of John to about 125 AD. Now, some of your atheist friends will say, well, that's 100 years. That's a lot of time for changes to be made, right? But again, do the comparison. How many copies do we have of some of these other documents, and how early are they? I like to use the Annals of Tacitus as a comparison. It's not the best example. It's not the ancient document with a large number of copies. But because Tacitus is considered the most reliable ancient historian, I like to use him as an example. How many copies of Tacitus's Annals do you suppose we have from ancient times? We have about 5,600 in Greek of the New Testament. Care to take a guess how many we have of Tacitus's Annals?
I don't know.
How's this?
3.
3 copies of the Annals of Tacitus. And how old do you think they are compared to that 125 AD for the New Testament first scrap, and then we have whole copies dating to like 200 years later? What do you think is the earliest copy we have of Tacitus's Annals?
I don't know.
How about the 11th century?
My goodness.
Keeping in mind that Tacitus wrote in the 2nd century, like about 115, 125 AD.
That's a long time.
That's a long time.
And in the classics department, you're not going to see them throwing him out the window.
Exactly. That is the point I wish to make. The secular textual scholars are not in a panic over these things. Now, they will say things like, yeah, it's kind of hard to figure out. We may not ever be sure exactly what was said over here or over there. But they're still working at the colleges. They haven't quit their jobs to become dishwashers. which is what some of these atheists apparently want us to do with the New Testament. Now, one of the things that these atheists will say when you point this kind of thing out to them, because they can't answer it, of course, is they'll say, well, no one says that the works of Tacitus are inerrant or inspired. Well, that's beside the point. That's completely beside the point. The evidence is still much better for the Bible, for the New Testament. Now, even if it's not inspired or inerrant or what have you, you still have a historical record to deal with. And on that basis, you still need to make the comparisons, and you're still going to have to admit that the New Testament is in better shape textually.
So they used to call this the bibliographical test, the amount of manuscripts that we have and the interval from the original to the extant copy. Then the internal test was, does the document claim to be what it appears to be? Then the external test said, is there other information outside the document that confirms that internal testimony? Where do we stand in that three-pronged argument?
Yeah, now you're getting into authorship now, and I want to explain one quick thing before we go further on the textual part, because this is something some of these atheists will do too. They'll put up this straw man. They'll say that in us saying that there are so many copies of the New Testament, that we are thereby arguing that you can trust that the events recorded in it happened. That is not what we're doing, okay? That's two separate issues. All we're talking about is how reliably it was copied over time. They'll try and mix it together and say we're claiming something. We're not about that. That's not what we're doing. But now you're talking about authorship. And in the book that I'm writing right now, I'm discussing three different aspects of making a case for who authored an ancient document. Again, my issue here is comparative, okay? Let's just start with the modern book as an example, okay? I've mentioned this book in another presentation we did. This is one of the books by the people who believe Jesus didn't exist. This is The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy. Now, how do we know that this was authored by Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy? Says so right here, doesn't it? Well, strange as that is, this is the first test for deciding who authored a document, ancient or modern. What does it say on the document itself? Okay, that's one of our first tests. Now, admittedly, there are some documents, such as the Gospel of Thomas, which are not by Thomas, that have Thomas's name on it. So this test does not stand by itself, but it is the first burden upon anyone who would doubt the authorship of a book. Now, if we found a copy of this book and it said Craig Johnson on it, okay, let's say we found a secret warehouse with a bunch of copies that said Craig Johnson on there, then maybe we could say, well, maybe this is questionable that Freke and Gandy wrote it, okay? That's what we need for the New Testament. Maybe a copy of Luke's Gospel that said Peter on it or something like that. But that's not what we find. Now, in terms of the Annals of Tacitus, which again I like to use as a comparison, we have Tacitus' name at the very beginning of those copies where we have the beginning, okay? And that's all we have. His name appears at the beginning. It doesn't appear anywhere else inside the text. So if you're going to be fair and judge the Annals and the New Testament documents by the same criteria, you'd have to say, on this point of internal attestation, whose name is on it, the New Testament's in far better shape. Now, I want to make a point of this, too. 27 New Testament books, okay? Hebrews is anonymous. That leaves 26. How many of those books do you suppose are regularly questioned by critics of Christianity in terms of their authorship? Do you know how many?
I don't know.
14 of them, okay? 14 out of 26 books are regularly attacked in terms of saying we don't know who actually wrote it. Paul's name is fake on there. Matthew's name is fake. Even Mark and Luke are sometimes attacked that way. Mostly 14 of those books. That's over half the New Testament. So this is obviously a significant issue.